The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host who invited both may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to the host who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. It's pretty clear that Jesus wants us to think about humility today. We have it in our first reading from the book of Sirach, where he says, "Humble yourself the more, the greater you are." Humble yourself the more, the greater you are. And then Jesus talks about humility in today's gospel passage, where he says, "Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted." And that that thinking of humility leads into Monday, where we'll actually celebrate the patron saint of this church, St. John the Baptist, specifically the beheading of St. John the Baptist. It's a very Catholic thing to have a feast day for the beheading of a saint. But of all of the things that St. John the Baptist said, my favorite is when he says, "He must increase and I must decrease." The he he's referring to is obviously Jesus. So here he is, the greatest prophet in the history of Israel, the final prophet to announce the coming of the Messiah. He had so many followers that people thought that he was the Messiah. And yet, my favorite line of his is, "He must increase, I must decrease." Even though John the Baptist was great, he took to heart the words from Sirach, where he says, "Humble yourself the more, the greater you are." Think of what people consider to be the definition of success or happiness. Words like intelligence, skill, work ethic, tenacity. They all come to mind. All of these things that make a successful person or a happy person. It's the American ideal. It sort of should read like a Hollywood story or the American dream of a family, a house, and a white picket fence. But if we look at a lot of the famous people or so-called successful people, what are their lives really like? Well, it's a lot of drama, tabloid stuff, breakups, infidelity, divorce, drug use, addiction. It's just it's generally fake. But we're tempted to believe through TV and movies and social media that they are happy and that this is what success looks like. And, if my lifestyle doesn't match theirs, well, there must be something wrong with me. I use the example often, but if you were to go to a little town called Agnew, Nebraska, and it's just north of Lincoln on Highway 79, and you go a couple miles west on a gravel road, you will find a Carmelite monastery where there are 25 women that live in complete poverty. They sleep on the floor. They don't eat meat unless it's a big feast day in the church calendar. They don't even wear shoes. They spend most of their day in silence and in prayer. They only get to see their family once a year or so, and that's only if their family comes to see them, because they aren't allowed to leave the grounds of the monastery. Their entire lives after they're professed religious are lived inside of the walls surrounding the monastery. They're even buried on the grounds of the monastery. Lives of total poverty, total chastity, and total obedience. And they're some of the happiest people I've ever met. They are joyful and confident and vibrant women. There's a rule in their religious order where they must build a new convent in another location if they get to have more than 25 members in their convent, in their monastery. And let's just say that they've had to build many convents across the country because young women from across the country and across the world have come to live this life of theirs. So, what's the difference between society's definition of happiness and the Carmelites' definition of happiness, which to me seems more rich and more deep? The answer, at least one of the answers to that question, is humility. Now, why is that? What does humility have to do with happiness? Well, it makes more sense when we understand what humility really means. Humility, the simplest understanding of humility is that we see ourselves through God's eyes. So that means that real humility is not the mistaken notion of humility, where we often think of humility as being weak, as lacking self-esteem, as being a pushover. But true humility isn't passive. It's not boring. True humility does not conjure up images of degradation and abjection. It does not make us think of peasant farmers in the Middle Ages. I think we get the idea that in order to be thought of as pious or holy, it also means that we have to be a doormat for others to step on, and that's not true. So, back to the definition of humility. Humility is seeing ourselves through God's eyes. And God, of course, sees all of us. So, if humility means seeing ourselves through God's eyes, that means that the humble person doesn't simply dwell on their weaknesses and flaws. The humble person also rejoices in their strengths. True humility loves the good in ourselves because we recognize that those are gifts that God has given to us. We rejoice in our gifts not because we are great, but because God is great. To downplay the gifts that God has given us would actually be a form of pride. Jesus talks about this all the time in the Gospels, the parable of the talents. The foolish man buries his talent out of fear, and Jesus rewards those who have invested their talent. It can be taken to mean like a real talent, like a skill, not just a form of money, that God expects us to do something with what he's given us. St. Benedict said that if a monk in his religious order had a wonderful singing voice, but they played it off as if they weren't such a great singer, or they sort of downplayed their singing ability, he would take them to task. He told them that was displeasing to God. So we should recognize the good in us and thank God for it. St. Teresa of Avila personally asked Jesus what humility meant. Wouldn't that be nice if we could just have regular conversations face-to-face with Jesus like she did? But Jesus answered her in reply. He said, "Humility is to know what you can do and to know what I can do." To know what you can do and to know what I can do. And that really takes us back to our first readings, where the author of the book of Sirach tells us, "What is too sublime for you, seek not. Into things beyond your strength, search not." In other words, don't worry about the things that are out of your control. Have faith in God instead. Every one of us is a person with weaknesses and talents, and yet we're all sinners, and we're infinitely loved by God, and we are in need of his mercy. And when we begin to see ourselves in that way and recognize both our weaknesses and our strengths, and ultimately our own dependency on God, if we take those aspects of us seriously, then eventually we'll tend to be a lot less frustrated by others' sinfulness, a lot less frustrated by other people's lack of virtue. We'll be less quick to judge, less quick to demand an apology, and quicker to love unconditionally. Quicker to love others no matter who they are or what they're going through or what they've done to you. Of course, at times, the highest form of love is steering somebody back in the right direction, but even more so, it requires us to pray for them and to entrust them to God's mercy. Love never includes complaining or gossiping or asking for more. So if I find myself judging others, I need to remind myself of humility, to remind myself that there are things that only God can do, and that's the case with every single person. I need to remind myself that I need to reflect upon more of what I can do and what God can do. So in the end, being truly humble means that you are able to see things the way that they actually are. It means that you know who you are and who God is. It means that you understand your place in the sort of the grand scheme of things. So do we truly know who we are? Do we truly know who God is? There are some practical things that we can do this week to make an attempt to see ourselves and the people around us from God's perspective. Now, to be very clear, the advice I'm about to give you is for things like hurt feelings or for frustrations or for feeling underappreciated or being ignored or something like that. This is not advice for what you should do if the situation is like abuse of any kind. That requires intervention, a change in lifestyle, perhaps counseling, and certainly contacting the authorities. So with that said, this week, reflect on what is frustrating to you. What is causing frustration in your life? It could be big, it could be small, it could be tiny. It could be things that you don't even think about consciously. But be aware, be self-reflective throughout the course of this week. They could be frustrations with yourself, frustrations with your work, frustration with someone else, a child, a parent, a spouse, a coworker, a boss, a neighbor, a friend, and think about how you feel after those interactions and after those frustrations, and about how much time and energy and high blood pressure we waste when dwelling on bad things. And here are some ways to redirect that frustration. Even if you're in a bad mood and don't feel like doing it, do these three things. Number one, thank God for the gifts that He has given you. That'll help put some perspective on it. There's much more to be happy about than there is to be mad about. Number two, thank God for that person or that thing that has frustrated you. Even if you do this begrudgingly through clenched fists and through clenched teeth, it'll turn your mind more towards God instead of that person or that thing that's frustrating you. And third, this sometimes is the hardest part, third, pray for that person. Pray for that situation. If you can't bring yourself to pray for that person or that situation, ask the saints to pray for that person or that situation. And don't pray, well, I wish this person would change, or I wish this person would do such and such, or I wish things would be this way rather than the way that they are. That's the equivalent of making demands on God. We don't want to do that. That usually ends in disaster. Because we can't see the whole picture like God can. We don't know what's really going on in another person's mind, in another person's heart. And perhaps God has sent that person or put us in that situation, no matter how unpleasant it might be at the time. Maybe He's given those situations to us to teach us something, to teach us humility. Maybe that person or that situation will help us to better understand who we are and who God is. And I would venture to guess, personally, that the frustrating and challenging people that in my life have taught me many more lessons than those who are not. Many more lessons than anyone else ever has. So our prayer for that person or that situation will be, God, help me to see you in them. Help this person to see themselves as you see them. Help this person to do your will, and help me to love this person as you love them. Here's a little example. It's kind of funny. This would fall into the minor category of annoyances or frustrations. Recently, Bishop Conley, with input and advice from his priests, he decided to allow priests in the Diocese of Lincoln to grow beards. I know it's not a big deal. It was a huge deal, trust me, among the priests. And there were some priests that weren't a fan of this decision. Perhaps they thought that having beards was unprofessional or unbecoming of a priest. But one of those priests who disagreed with the bishop, he took that frustration to prayer. And he recognized a lack of humility in himself. Perhaps he realized that growing beards isn't that big of a deal. Or perhaps he recalled his promise of respect and obedience to the bishop that he made on the day of his ordination. Whatever happened to that priest in that prayer, that priest now has the biggest, bushiest, manliest beard you've ever seen. And he did it out of humility. And that is true humility, where we know who we are and who God is, and let him handle the things that we cannot. If we live life in that way, with that sort of intention, it makes life a lot more bearable. There are less reasons to get angry, less reasons to get frustrated. And it'll help us to better see ourselves, in ourselves, the God who made us in his image. It'll help us to better see ourselves in all of our weaknesses and all of our strengths. And we'll realize that so many of the things that we concern ourselves or get frustrated over, they're either A, out of our control, or B, not really that big of a deal. And in many cases, that sort of humility will allow us to lighten up a little bit. If you look at Jesus, he can be quite accurately described as the only person that was ever born in order to die. All of us were born for eternal life, but the main reason Jesus came to this earth was to redeem us. And given all that heaviness of his mission, it's incredible to think of how joyful and how happy he was. Jesus wasn't stoic or unrelatable. He wasn't unhappy or sour. He never once told us that the key to holiness was to hang our heads. He had a great sense of humor. I mean, his parables to me are all hilarious. Threading camels through eyes of needles, pulling planks out of people's eyes, handing snakes and scorpions to their son instead of egg. He wasn't a killjoy, Jesus. His first miracle involved making a few 100 gallons of wine. He hung out with a bunch of sailors. I'm sure he laughed a lot. But Jesus was above all humble. But he's God, so he was beyond humble. He created us out of nothing, and yet he humbled himself to take on our very flesh. He's eternal, with no beginning or end, and yet he humbled himself to be mocked and scourged and spat upon and nailed to a piece of wood. The entire universe cannot contain him, and yet he humbles himself to be contained within us, under the appearances of bread and wine. What does that tell us? It tells us that humility isn't a matter of cowering before God. It isn't a fear out of what God might do next. If that were the case, then God wouldn't have come to us as a teacher or as a shepherd or as a priest. Instead, he's telling us that humility is ultimately realized in love. And that's what he came to show us. That in order to live life the fullest, we have to, in a sense, give it away. It is only in making a gift of ourselves that we can learn to be humble. It's only in humility that we can find actual happiness. In today's gospel, Jesus tells us not to take the place of honor. So pray to see things as they truly are, to know what you can do, and to know what God can do. And one day he may say to us, the words of the gospel we just heard, "My friend, come up higher and enter into the presence of the King."